I've never had the best relationship with my family. They have always been very religious and strict. At first they were Baptists until they became Seventh-day Adventists around the time I was 11. They have always been very religious and very strict. When I was a kid, my dad would often beat me for the slightest thing. Sometimes I feel that I deserved it, when I hadn't done my homework or I broke a house rule. But most of the time I feel that it wasn't deserved. Here are some examples in no particular order. My family had goats at one point and they would often escape the shoddy fencing my dad had put up. One day after feeding them some vegetable scraps, I left their pen and the gate had failed to latch properly. I did not notice this. Later in the day I was doing homework in the kitchen and my dad came in from outside. He proceeded to abruptly grab the back of my head and slam my face into the table and then kicked the chair out beneath me, knocking me to the ground. Mind you, this was the first time this had ever happened. I've never left the gate unlatched before. He then yelled at me for 2 hours about how stupid I was and how I never pay enough attention. One day while taking water and chicken feed down to our chickens in the middle of winter, I was walking slowly as to not spill any water and because it was icy. While I was entering through the fencing, my dad said I was taking too long and I was going to let the chickens out. He then proceeded to give me a swift kick to the butt. With his steel-toed boots on, he ended up hitting my tailbone and cracking it. I fell down, dumping water all over myself and screaming in pain. He got mad that I dropped the water and after feeding the chickens, and he left me alone in the pen until I eventually crawled back up to the house. Walking was very difficult and painful for about a month after that. I told my mom and dad about it, but my dad said I was overreacting and told me to grow up. I was 12. I had hurt my ankle once due to some tendon issue when I was 13, and so I was moving around the house at a slower pace and visually limping. My dad, seeing this, thought I was putting on a show and decided to have me race my brother in our yard. But if I started to fall behind, he would run behind me and kick me until I caught back up. My brother was 3 years younger than me and taller, but I was still faster than him under normal circumstances. This was not a normal circumstance. So basically my father kicked me down a hill and back up a hill in some messed up race. My mother took me to a hospital about a week after, only to find out that I had a misaligned tendon in my right ankle. Every time my father would beat me, he would have a talk with me before bed about how much he loves me and how he wished I could see that he was doing it all out of love. I never felt loved. I felt like a burden, and when I would express this I would get grounded and be told how ungrateful I was. I was often bullied at school as well, and my dad's advice was to be a better fighter and I'd get beat up less. I have been 4 foot for most of my life. Now that I'm 24 I'm only 5 feet 2, so I've never been able to defend myself very well. My mother would sympathize with me but would never do anything to help me. She has had a bad marriage and has threatened to leave my dad multiple times but never has. She is much more content with putting up with it than actually doing anything. Most of the time my mom would take my dad's side, leaving me with no one to turn to. I often fantasized about suicide because I thought that if I did, someone might finally care and my worries would finally be over. One day I sat in my room when no one was around with a knife to my throat for hours, crying and thinking how much better my life could have been if I had never lived it. But I decided not to kill myself, because if I did I would go to hell and burn for an eternity. How can my suffering end if there is just more suffering on the other side? So years later, after enduring my family, I finally moved out at 19 and I was finally happy. I got married and we had a son. However, my son has only caused me more trouble. After my son was born, we had trouble making ends meet, so we were forced to leave our apartment once the lease was up and get help from my family. We had no one else to turn to and I was extremely worried what I would be coming back to. It wasn't like the past, it was different but not for the better. We first tried to stay at my grandparents' dad's, but that didn't last long. My grandfather often argued that I wasn't doing enough. He had no idea how the real world worked and thought that I could easily make 20 plus an hour if I just asked for a job. I was working, but it was seasonal positions and odd jobs that could net me the most money, but I was only making 14 an hour. My grandfather kicked us out over the weekend once because his burglar alarm went off and my 7-month pregnant wife couldn't get downstairs fast enough to turn it off before police had called him. They were out of town at the time, so we were forced to leave and live with my parents for a while. My mother's parents were living with them during the summer at the time, and my grandmother was far from supportive. Once we had the baby, they would constantly talk down to us and degrade us whenever he would cry because it kept them awake. They brought my wife to tears on multiple occasions and myself to tears as well. They noticed that my wife and I were avoiding my father and they told me to forgive him and move on. That he was never as bad as I thought he was and how I was being disobedient and petty for not forgiving him. He threatened me once before we were able to move out. Luckily my wife caught him and stood up for me, and he would only yell at me for random things after that. We eventually were able to move back out, and once we did, we avoided them like the plague. We hardly ever answered their phone calls, but they still would come over to our apartment and demand to see our son. This went on every week for almost 3 years, until just recently we decided we wanted to move far away so they couldn't find us and we could finally have some peace. So without telling them, we moved 1,000 miles away, and we just moved into our new apartment this Monday. While we were driving out here, they have been calling us non-stop and demanding to know where we went. We decided it was best to block their phone numbers and ignore them. Just today, they had my aunt send me a message saying that, since I felt the need not to contact them, they are going to get the police involved, and that she wanted me to call them because they were bothering her about my disappearance. Quote,